Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Melanie Michna. I'm from the Clinical Social Neuroscience Lab at the University of Vienna, and I'm very happy to speak to you today about objectifying sexualized individuals, the role of attentional biases, self-other distinction, and animalistic and mechanistic dehumanization. Sexualization is actually quite common in our nowadays world. It can be seen in advertising. It has been discussed in the sports area recently. It is also part of the children's area. It can be seen in children's toys, in video games, and it is also becoming more and more frequent in the male domain. Sexualization, meaning the overrepresentation of a person's body or a greater focus on sexualized body parts compared to the face, has been linked to several related health issues. One of them is violence against sexualized individuals. A possible mechanism that could explain this relation is reduced empathy towards sexualized individuals. And while it is quite clear how reduced empathy can lead to violence against those individuals, it is not so clear how sexualization can lead to reduced empathy. And this research gap we wanted to look at in our project. There have been proposed 3 possible mechanisms that might explain the relationship between sexualization and empathy. And we would like to look into, or we wanted to look into these mechanisms in our study. So the first proposed mechanism is an attentional bias. It has been proposed that people look less into the faces of sexualized targets because the attention is drawn away towards sexualized body parts such as the chest or the pelvic area. And therefore, if we don't look into people's faces, we can, of course, not have so much empathy with those people. The second proposed mechanism is dehumanization. It has been found that sexualized individuals are not seen as a fully human person, either in an animalistic or in a mechanistic way, meaning that they would be perceived more animal-like or more like an anthropomorphic object or a doll, for example. And for self-other distinction, it has been found that people tend to distance themselves from sexualized representations of their own gender, whereas they distance themselves less from sexualized individuals of the opposite gender. And this could mean that the same mechanism working in 2 different directions might lead to the same conclusion, namely that we have less empathy for sexualized individuals. In our study, we had a sample of 104 participants between 18 and 35 years old, and we showed them pictures of sexualized and non-sexualized men and women. What is important to understand is that the same person does never see the same model in 2 different outfits. So in order to make it realistic and that the people do not guess the purpose of the study, for example, participant A sees the woman with brown hair in a casual outfit, whereas they see the blonde woman in the sexy outfit. And then participant B would see the brown hair woman in the sexy outfit and the blonde woman in the casual outfit, and the same with men. In our first study, we wanted to relate these mechanisms proposed to sexualization. So how did we do that? For the attentional biases, we used eye tracking. In the first task, participants were asked to freely view the pictures of the Confederates, and we were telling them that these people were participants of our previous studies about pain perception and that they should just freely view the pictures and will be asked some questions about the persons afterwards. The second mechanism, dehumanization, was measured with 2 tasks. One is a more implicit task of a morphing video and a more classical measure of dehumanization, namely the Haslam scale, the 40 trait items for human nature and unique human traits. These morphing videos showed the faces of these models, so either of the sexualized or the non-sexualized men and women, morphing slowly into an animal or a doll. And the participants were asked to press a button once they see more of the second face the video is morphing into. So at the beginning of the video, for example, here with this ape, you would see at the beginning of the video the model's face 100%, and at the end of the video you would see the ape's face 100%, and in the middle of the video it would be 50% ape and 50% human. And this was then taken to interpret the percentage of frames of the animal or the doll that is seen in these human beings. And then the third mechanism, dissimilarity, was also measured with two different tasks. One, again, the morphing video, where at this time the faces of the models morphed into the participants' faces, and a more explicit question, how similar are you to this person? So the participants saw all these videos in a randomized order and all videos in both directions. And to show you an example of such a morphing video, you can see my face now morphing into one of the models. Here are the preliminary results of the first study. So what is important for us is kind of a manipulation check, is always to ask about the sexiness of these pictures. So the people were asked, how sexy do you think this person is of all the four people they saw? And indeed, what came out in a repeated measure mixed ANOVA is that the sexy individuals, the sexualized individuals, were rated as more sexy than the non-sexualized individuals. The intelligence ratings showed that people in a casual outfit were rated as more intelligent than people in a sexy outfit. We also asked for attractiveness because we wanted to really distinguish between sexiness and attractiveness ratings. However, it was also a significant interaction between outfit and target gender, meaning that sexy men were rated as more attractive than casual men, and also sexy women were rated as more attractive than casual women. Then for familiarity ratings, we also asked participants how familiar they are with these pictures, because we didn't want sexualized pictures to be very unfamiliar and strange to the people, and there was no effect on the outfit. We also asked for agency and experience rating, showing that agency as the ability to plan, to self-control, and to act morally was reduced in sexualized compared to non-sexualized targets, whereas experience ratings, defined as the ability to experience pleasure, hunger, or desire, are enhanced in sexualized targets, as we would have expected. These are the first results of the eye tracking measure. You can see a heat map here on duration based, and for the male targets, we can see that it goes in the direction of our hypothesis, namely that the men in casual outfits are looked into the face longer than the men in the sexualized outfit. So red or orange, so the warm colors here, stand for longer duration in the casual outfits, whereas the cold colors, blue and green, show more longer duration in the sexy outfits. What can be clearly seen also is that the muscles that could be seen in the sexualized men were looked at more in the sexy pictures. So for the women, our hypothesis was not confirmed. As you can see, mainly at the left picture with the blonde woman, is that the women in casual outfits were not looked more into the face than the women in sexy outfits. We don't know yet why. We think it might have to do something with the heavy makeup the women were wearing, because it's also part of sexualization to have this heavy makeup. But for the next study, we want to do it with not so much difference on makeup. The next mechanism we looked into was dehumanization. And with the Haslam trade words, we could clearly see that people in casual outfits were attributed more uniquely human traits, except for the male participants rating male pictures. So there was an overall main effect on outfit. However, there was also a participant gender, outfit, target gender interaction that showed that this increase in human uniqueness for casual outfits was there for female targets rating female pictures, for female targets rating male pictures, for male targets rating female pictures, but it was not there for male targets rating male pictures, although it was in the same direction, but it was not significant in the post hoc tests. For human nature, this was in the other direction as we expected. So what we could find here is that people in the sexy outfit receive higher human nature attributes than in the casual outfit, and this was also significant. We would have expected it in the other way around. However, it's an interesting point to discuss. For the implicit dehumanization task, the morphing videos, the only video that was significant was the one in the direction from the casual and sexy woman towards the Barbie doll. So what you can see here is a display of the video that people saw. It started from 100% human and ended with 100% Barbie. And participants were asked to rate when do you see more of the second face. So in this case, the Barbie. And there was a significant difference between the sexy and the casual women that were morphed into this Barbie. Participants pressed the button later when the sexy woman morphed into the Barbie than when the casual morphed into the Barbie. And this was as we expected, meaning that there was seen more Barbie face in the sexy faces than in the casual faces. And for this similarity, we found an overall main effect of outfit showing that all people felt more similar to casual representations of men and women. And for the implicit morphing between the participants and the models, we found no significant effect. And then I come to an outlook for our second study, where we want to relate these mechanisms to empathy and pro-social behavior. So in the first run, in an fMRI task, participants will see either a picture of themselves or of one of the confederates who are coming to the scanner and will be there in person. And they think that the person is receiving a shock on the back of their hand. After the delivery of the shock, the people are asked to rate cognitive and affective empathy, and we hypothesize that there will be less empathy for sexualized men and women. In the second run of the fMRI study, we then give the participants the option to reduce the electrical shock that the target individuals get. So they see whether they get a high shock or not, and then there is a possibility of a decision, but a participant can decide whether they want to help by taking half of the shock on their own, so that the target individual will not get the full shock. Or they cannot help and watch the other person gain the shock, or there's a third option also to watch a distracting video and still have the other person receiving the shock. I would like to thank very much the Clinical Social Neuroscience Unit of the University of Vienna. Special thanks to my supervisor, Giorgia Zilani. And I wish you all a nice time and hope to see you in person soon.
Hello, my name is Rocío Martínez, and I'm going to present the work called Dehumanization of Powerful Women. I'd like to present two studies, but before I'm going to present the main concepts related with the research that we have carried out. And finally, I will summarize the main results in the conclusion. As you all may know, prejudice is still alive, although it may be manifested in many different ways. Indeed, a form of bias is to consider people from different groups as being less human than individuals from one's group. Dehumanization of others could be considered to be one of the worst forms of prejudice. It truly seems difficult to imagine anything more negative than considering others as not be fully human beings. From social psychology, it seems important to try to understand these processes of dehumanization. However, social psychology has only recently started to find out the reasons why it's so difficult to grant equal humanness to all human beings. Most of the studies have shown that dehumanization is observed with many different groups. For instance, refugees, immigrants, or homeless are groups that are quite often dehumanized. However, little attention has been paid to the dehumanization of women. Some studies have shown that high hostile sexist individuals were more likely to dehumanize women than low hostile sexist individuals. It's important to remember that this form of sexism seeks to justify the male power, the traditional gender roles, and the men's exploitation of women as sexual objects through derogatory images of women. In addition, other studies have shown that objectified women are dehumanized by both men and women, but for different reasons. Also, dehumanizing women and male sexual aggression are positively correlated. In this research, we focus on women that today do not conform to the traditional gender roles. We focus on working women with power and that they could be considered leaders. Quite often, we observe that people have negative views of these non-traditional women, and we wonder if they are dehumanized. In order to research this question, we carry out two studies. The aim of the study one was to investigate the effect of the sexist attitudes on the dehumanization of women in a professional context. We predict that hostile sexist individuals will have more negative evaluation of these non-conforming women compared to the low hostile sexist individuals. In this first study, we had two different experimental conditions. Participants were asked to read a description about an employee who held a power position in a company. They were randomly assigned to one of the two experimental conditions. In one condition, the description of the employee was related to a woman with power, and in the other experimental condition, the protagonist was a man. But before reading the manipulation, they were asked to rate the ambivalent sexism inventory in Spanish. After reading the manipulation, they had to rate the humanity scale, and also we had some questions about the positive and negative emotion that participants express to the protagonist of the scenario, and also we measure the perception of power and legitimacy, the attribution of competence, and the intention to work with the protagonist of this scenario. Finally, we add the demographic questions. What we found is that participants express more positive emotion and less negative emotion to the powerful woman compared to the powerful man. Also, she was perceived as being more legitimate to hold this position, and she was perceived as more competent than the powerful man. We didn't find significant difference in the attribution of power. We think that the most important result in this research is the one that you can observe in this slide. What we found is that the sexism, the hostile sexism of the participants impact on the humanity that participants attributed to the powerful woman or the powerful man protagonist of the scenario. As you can see, when we focus on the powerful men in the scenario, high hostile sexist and low hostile sexist individuals attributed the same humanity. However, what we found is that the high hostile sexist individuals attributed less humanity compared to the low hostile sexist individuals. In a second study, we wondered what were the reasons that might lead individuals to dehumanize powerful women. So again, we used the same manipulation that I presented before, but in this case, we included in the dependent variables a scale about the perception of threat that these protagonists of the scenario could generate on the participants. And also we measure the attitudes toward the affirmative action and also the scales about the men's collective interest. Our results show the same pattern of result that we found in study 1. As you can see, again, the high hostile sexist individuals attributed less humanity to the powerful woman compared to the low hostile sexist individuals. In addition, we found that the hostile sexism, but also the benevolent sexism, was related to the threat and the other dependent variables that we included in this study. To sum up the main results, we found on the one hand that women were the protagonist woman, the powerful woman was perceived as being more human, more competent, and also more with more legitimacy to hold this power position. And also participants expressed more positive emotion and less negative emotion. We wonder if this result could be framed in the Women Are Wonderful effect that show that have shown that women are, generally speaking, evaluated more positively than men overall. But we need more studies to prove these ideas. And on the other hand, the other result that we found is that when analyzing the influence of the sexism, we observe that people with high hostile sexism dehumanize more women. In addition, we observe that hostile sexism was related to the perception of threat that women can generate in position of power. We think that we need more research, more studies. We are actually working on new studies to run in this semester that could determine and could find out the consequence of this lower attribution of humanity to women by sexist people. And that's all. Thank you for your attention. And here you can find my email address just in case you need to write something or ask something. Thank you very much again.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Daniela Ruzzante, a research assistant at the University of Trento. And the project that I'm presenting you regards the investigation of sexual objectification from an implicit behavioral point of view that might affect social interaction more in general. As some of you might already know, sexual objectification is a phenomenon that implies others, especially women, to be seen and considered only for her appearance and bodily function, without regard for her personality or dignity. This phenomenon often implies the denial of humanity and human characteristics that consequentially have some negative consequences not only on the way objectified women are perceived, but also consequences that might affect their everyday life. Indeed, depriving a woman from personality and human trait has shown to have important negative consequences. Sexually objectified women more likely become victims of sexual violence, sexual harassment, or unwanted sexual advance or social exclusion. However, most of this research has focused on explicit harassing, sexual aggression or social exclusion behaviors when studying the consequence of sexual objectification, meaning that, to our knowledge, hardly any research to date has tried to understand changes in unconscious behavior that is likely to affect social interaction with objectified and non-objectified women. For this reason, we decided to focus on the mimicry responses. Mimicry can indeed be thought as the unconscious and unintentional imitation of other people's posture, gesture, mannerism, moods, and emotions that allow people to understand others' emotion and intention, and this is fundamental in all our social interaction. Indeed, mimicry has been related with relationship goal and liking. Participant whose goal was to affiliate with a confederate exhibited more mimicry than those who did not have such a goal. Moreover, mimicry has also been shown to change the function of stigmatized or dehumanized individuals, showing how facing out-group compared to in-group member led participants to exhibit the less mimicry behavior. More recently, mimicry has also been related to perception of humanity. The less participants evaluated an android as human-like, the less they had mimicry responses. So with this in mind, we aim at exploring the unconscious mimicry behavior when objectified and non-objectified women were represented, expressing genuine emotion. Specifically, we wanted to understand if a possible negative consequence of the process of sexual objectification might impact on a real social interaction. Indeed, a lack of mimicry in interaction has been shown to result in less smooth interaction and less liking of the interaction partner, leading to the avoidance of such interaction in the near future. Project, we presented video of sexually objectified and non-objectified model expressing anger and happiness. To create the videos, we selected pictures of neutral, low-intensity and high-intensity happiness and anger, and we morphed them together in a 6-second video. The video started with a model expressing a neutral expression that slowly changed into the expression of a low-intensity emotion that gradually reached the high-intensity emotion after around 3 seconds, followed by an offset phase in which the emotional phase came back to the final neutral expression. Here, an example of the same model expressing anger in the non-objectified condition. We conducted 2 experiments. In the first one, participant electrophysiological facial movement of the zygomaticus major and the corrugator supercilia were registered. The experiment implies the random representation of the videos and was composed of 2 parts. In a first spontaneous condition, participants were simply instructed to observe the videos without receiving any instruction or encouragement to mimic. In a second intentional condition, participants were instead explicitly asked to express the same emotion as the target, allowing us to control whether participants recognized the emotion correctly. In addition, we controlled participant eye movement during the whole experiment, and results confirmed that they looked at the face of the model while she was expressing the emotion. Finally, participants were asked to complete a final questionnaire at the end of the experiment that aimed at measuring the mental capacity that they would attribute to each model, and also, since mimicry has been related to empathy, we wanted to control the level of dispositional empathy of each participant, and we analyzed a total of 67 participants. A first important result was a significant main effect of objectification in the mimicry responses. We found that the participant exhibited less mimicry responses to objectified compared to non-objectified models only in the spontaneous condition. meaning that when participants were simply asked to observe the video, they mimicked less the objectified target compared to their non-objectified counterparts, regardless of the expressed emotion. However, even if we did not have any significant interaction between objectified and emotion, we decided to verify whether emotion might influence this implicit behavior. For this reason, we analyzed participant mimicry responses separately for anger and happiness, and we found a significant main effect of objectification only in the emotion of happiness. Therefore, participants mimicked less objectified versus non-objectified targets, especially when they were expressing happiness. Regarding the dehumanization analysis, results revealed that objectified models were attributed less agency but more experience attribute compared to the non-objectified models. Thus, while the objectified models were clearly denied agentic trait, they were attributed with more experience-related attribute compared to the non-objectified models. And this pattern of result is in line with a partial dehumanization of objectified women linked to the agentic but not experience-related trait. Finally, we found a significant correlation between the fantasy subscale of the interpersonal reactivity index that measures people's capacity to transport oneself into the feelings or action of others in books or movies, and the mimicry responses of participants toward objectified models who expressed happiness. So this result is able to partially demonstrate how mimicry responses are related with empathic predisposition of participants. However, we decided to conduct a second data collection with the aim to replicate the result of experiment 1 and resolve some of its unexpected findings. Indeed, even though previous research has shown that the recognition and imitation of happiness seems to be easy and more sensitive compared to that of negative emotion, we did expect an objectification effect on anger as well. Moreover, we wanted also to control whether objectified models were attributed less human characteristics more in general, regardless of the differentiation between agency and experience. And finally, we also wanted to increase our sample size. Therefore, in a second experiment, we used the same videos of objectified and non-objectified model expressing happiness and anger, but we changed a bit the paradigm. In this case, indeed, videos of objectified and non-objectified women expressing anger and happiness were divided into two blocks. In this way, participants did not have to switch between emotion all the time, as in experiment 1, presenting all video of objectified and non-objectified women expressing anger, followed by a block in which all female targets expressed the emotion of happiness. The order of the blocks was counterbalanced between participants. Moreover, we also added a second humanization scale measuring both senses of humanness, human nature and human uniqueness, and we also added a scale able to detect participant ability to regulate their emotion, the emotion regulation questionnaire. And in this case, we analyzed a total of 90 participants. Regarding the result, we were able to confirm the result of experiment 1, and we found a significant main effect of objectification, showing how participants mimicked less objectified target compared to non-objectified target, regardless of the expressed emotion. However, even in this case, we wanted to control for any emotion effect, even though in none of these analyses the interaction between objectification and emotion emerged significantly. In study 2, we found a significant main effect of objectification only for the emotion of anger, showing how participants exhibited less mimicry responses to objectified versus non-objectified targets, especially when they were expressing anger. Regarding the emotion of happiness, we found only a marginal significant result. Regarding the dehumanization analysis, the mind attribution scale showed that, partially in line with the result of experiment 1, objectified women were denied agentic attributes, while no differences appeared for the evaluation of experience. Regarding the second dehumanization scale, we decided to average the item related to human nature and human uniqueness into a single index, in order to verify whether participants evaluated the objectified models compared to the non-objectified models as having less mental capacity in general, in order to not differentiate between human nature and human uniqueness. And we indeed found a significant main effect of objectification, showing how participants evaluated objectified models as having less mental capacity in general. Finally, we also found a significant correlation between the personal distress subscale of the interpersonal reactivity index that measures people's unease in interpersonal settings and the mimicry responses of participants toward objectified models who express anger. Therefore, Since empathy has already shown to be influenced in context of sexual objectification, these results might suggest how specific empathic predisposition might differently influence the imitation of anger and happiness. So while the capacity to step into others' feeling was related to imitation of happiness in experiment 1, distress in intergroup relation was related to the mimicry of anger only for objectified women in experiment 2. So future research should focus on what external behavior, like approach or avoidance tendency, guided these explicit and empathic responses that might affect social interaction more in general. To finally conclude, this research study is the first one that clearly shows how unconscious mimicry behavior, that comprise a fundamental element in all our social interaction, is flattened when emotions are expressed by an objectified woman. Moreover, this study showed a more subtle and spontaneous consequence of sexual objectification that might influence social interaction more generally. Finally, it's important to note that this implicit behavior occurs without having to pass through consciousness, meaning that it is harder to control, and this might be a promising avenue for future research in order to study sexual objectification from a more implicit and unconscious level. I really thank you for your attention.
Hi everyone, my name is Ângela Romão. I'm a PhD student at ISCTE, Lisbon. I'm supervised by Professor Isabel Correia, and today I will present to you the results of 3 studies that I conducted about the dehumanization of informal caregivers. So informal caregivers are individuals that provide unpaid care in the intimate environment who has limitations in their physical, mental, or cognitive functioning. For example, elderly people or a child who's born with a complex health condition. And they are important because they have been the main healthcare providers to the high cost of care homes and professional services at home and the insufficient healthcare network. Indeed, it is estimated that 80% of care in Europe is provided by informal caregivers, and that in Portugal there are more than 800,000 informal caregivers, the country with highest rates of informal care in Europe. We also know that because of the COVID-19, the number of informal caregivers and also the intensity of care increased. Informal care is mostly provided by family. 2/3 of them are women with middle age, low education, low socioeconomic status, and most of them don't have jobs. They perform a diverse type of activities like personal hygiene, eating, mobility, emotional support, and despite they take care of their dependents, some of them for 24 hours a day, and they huge responsibilities, they don't receive any economical return, even saving to the Portuguese state 4 billion euros per year. And multiple studies widely documented the negative impacts of informal care on a personal level, for example, physical and emotional health problems, financial, for example, poverty, career, because they've been forced to quit work to provide care, and on a social level, for example, isolation. However, the social perception of informal caregivers has been completely ignored. Indeed, 93 stigmatized groups and implications for their health and well-being have been identified, but informal caregivers were not considered among them. And despite the huge number of informal caregivers and their huge responsibilities, this group remains invisible without support and with a lack of recognition. And we thought that this lack of attention of this huge group was somehow surprising, but we found that several studies reported that low status and low income workers are socially devalued, being subjected to dehumanization, so they are perceived with high worth, but with a lack of intelligence and competence. And we think the same can happen in the perception of informal caregivers, since they are unpaid workers. So we propose to analyze if the humanization of formal caregivers and if the belief in a just world can help to explain the social devaluation of informal caregivers. So we based our studies in two main theoretical models, the belief in a just world and the humanization. The belief in a just world is a motivation to perceive the world as fair. So people with high belief in a just world, that higher perceive the world as a just place where individuals get what they deserve, when are confronted with an innocent victim of a persistent suffering, are threatened by their situation, their suffering, and adopt some defensive mechanisms, processes. For example, avoid the victim, blame the victim for her situation, or humanize the victim in order to restore their justice perception, to maintain the belief that the world is a fair place, and this is a form to legitimize the situation of the victim, accepting and justifying her situation as worthy. And it is important also to note that the humanization leads to a lower perception of the suffering of the victim, and these concepts are related. Regarding the humanization, as we know, is a process of denying to certain groups and individuals human traits and characteristics. So it's a process of perceiving or treating others as if they are less than feel human. And we base our studies in the mixed model of humanization proposed by Lee and colleagues that integrates the stereotype content model, the mind perception theory, and the dual model of humanization. So according to this model, when we denied competence, agency, and human uniqueness traits like civility, that is exclusively human traits, we perceive others as warm but incompetent, like animals, the animalistic humanization. On the other hand, when we deny interpersonal warmth, experience, and human nature traits to others, that is attributes that share with other animals, we perceive others as competent but cold, like objects or machines, the mechanistic dehumanization. So our specific objectives are to analyze if informal caregivers are humanized and if the belief in a just world is a significant predictor of their humanization. For that, we conducted 3 studies, 1 qualitative study and 2 experimental studies. And regarding the first study, the qualitative one, we had the objective to analyze if informal caregivers are humanizing in the Portuguese print media. For that, we selected 4 Portuguese newspapers, Expresso, Público, Diário de Notícias e Jornal de Notícias, and we used the term informal caregivers to search for the news, resulting in a sample of 140 articles between January 2016 and March 2020. The data was analyzed according to a thematic analysis using NVivo software and based on the theoretical model of humanization. The thematic analysis revealed 4 main themes related to the humanization of informal caregivers, the warm caregivers, no future beyond care, no competence, and recommendations to be a successful caregiver. Regarding the first theme, warm caregivers, we found that informal caregivers are perceived as warm individuals that take care of others with love and compassion. So they are perceived with human nature traits. An example is many of these people become caregivers for love. Informal caregivers are also perceived as passive individuals that live only to take care of others, that can't be able to make their own decisions, and this is associated with a lack of unique human traits and characteristics. For example, their connection is constant and their mission is permanent. And despite they acquire a lot of skills from caring, they are perceived with a lack of intelligence and competence. being denied them uniquely human traits. And an example is the need to acquire certain knowledge and tools. And the last team reinforces their denial of unique human traits related to the competence, since it is recommended to them education and self-care programs. And with the content of these 4 teams, we can conclude that informal caregivers are animalistically humanized. They are perceived in Portuguese print media as high warm but incompetent individuals. Regarding the second and third studies, and to achieve the same objective, we created an online survey on Qualtrics for each study and recruited participants via Facebook, LinkedIn, and through SPI, a scholarship promoted by Lab. So the sample of the studies were composed mainly by women, and participants were randomly assigned to one of the 2 experimental conditions, the female informal caregiver targets or female targets regarding the second study, and male informal caregiver targets or male targets regarding the third study. An informal caregiver targets condition describes the daily tasks provided by the informal care to his or her spouse that became paraplegic after a car accident. The neutral condition only identified the name and the age of the targets, and after participants of each study completed a free word association task where they are asked to freely associate 3 to 5 characteristics to the targets. The data of the free word association technique were analyzed using a similitude analysis performed with the Euromutech software. And regarding the results of the study 2, we found that the female targets was perceived with full humanness, since she was associated with both positive, uniquely human traits like competence, intelligence, and human nature traits. She was perceived as extrovert. However, the female informal caregiver target was perceived with a more simplistic image, since she was associated with positive human nature traits like she was perceived as warm, altruistic, but with a restricted negative emotional range. She was perceived also as isolated, frustrated, sad, resigned, and burdened, and she was perceived with a lack of unique human traits associated with competence or intelligence. The results of the study 3 with the male targets are similar, and we found with these 2 studies that informal caregivers were animalistically humanized. They are perceived with high warmth but low competence, and this phenomenon is not only restricted to women informal caregivers. To analyze if the belief in a just world is a predictor of the minimization of informal caregiver suffering, the concept related to the dehumanization, participants of the study 2 and 3 also completed a burnout measure referring to the informal caregiver targets and a belief in a just world measure referring to themselves. We found in study 2 with the female informal caregiver target that the higher the belief in a just world of the participants, they less perceive the suffering of the female informal caregiver targets. However, we didn't find the same results in study 3, and it is possible that this happened because of the characteristics of the sample, which is mainly composed by women, and probably they didn't feel threatened by the victimization of the male targets. In conclusion, we found that informal caregivers were dehumanized in the Portuguese print media, The female and male informal caregiver targets were more humanized than the neutral targets, and that the belief in a just world in study 2 was a significant predictor of the minimization of informal caregiver suffering. And we know that the humanization is associated with seeing others with a lack of status, and this leads to reduced pro-social behaviors and support for policies towards them, and can help stronger believers in a just world to restore their justice perception. To finalize, these studies had important theoretical and practical contributions, since this is the first investigation that shed light about the humanization of informal caregivers, that use these theoretical models to study this social group, and could provide a better understanding about the mechanisms that can help to explain their lack of intention. So thank you for your attention.
Hi everyone. In this talk, I will present you a research conducted with Stefano Pagliaro, Manuel Teresi, and Luca Andrighetto on the link between perceptual job insecurity, self-objectification, and well-being. Let's start with a brief definition of worker self-objectification, that is a specific kind of self-demonization, and refers to the process by which workers self-perceive and self-evaluate as objects as a consequence of work-related factors. And as for the general phenomenon of objectification, when we speak about self-objectification of workers, we refer to the two main dimensions of this phenomenon, so the instrumentality and the denial of humanness. So workers, when self-objectify, self-perceive as more instrument-like than human-like, and self-perceive as lacking humanness, human fetus. And for example, self-attribute less mental states that usually define our humanness. Self-objectification in the work domain can be caused by different factors, such as the objectifying treatment by the superior, and can be caused by specific objectifying work features, such as repetitiveness, fragmentation, and other directions that could characterize the performed activity, work activity. And self-objectification has been found to be associated to different detrimental consequences. In the present research, we wanted to analyze if a further crucial factor of our work system that characterize the current work system can have an impact on this self-objectifying perception. And this factor is the perception of job insecurity. And furthermore, we wanted to verify if self-objectifying perception in the work domain can be also associated with decreased workers' well-being. So why we focus on this perception of job insecurity? We define perceived job insecurity as a subjective phenomenon that concerns the perception of uncertainty, of uncontrollability, about an involuntary loss of the current job in the future. And a lot of research, a lot of literature found that this perception of job insecurity is one of the main stressing factors for today's worker and can undermine workers' well-being. And why there is this link between perception of job insecurity and decreased well-being? There are a lot of explanations for this link, but here we focus on a specific one, and in particular we consider that the perception of job insecurity involves a state of uncontrollability, a feelings of uncontrollability, a feeling of fear for the future, and these feelings are strictly related to workers' well-being and are intrinsically related to a sense of powerlessness and a lack of agency. And so we started from this evidence by reasoning that this state of uncontrollability and about the events usually characterize passive entities that cannot control their action but are controlled by external forces such as objects, rather than the nature of agents, of active entities such as human beings that can manage their action and foresee what is going to happen. And so we hypothesize that this perception of job security, characterized by this state of uncontrollability that usually characterize passive entities, should be related to an increased tendency to self-perceive as objects, so as a passive entities more than active entities, then that in turn should be associated should contribute to this decrease of workers' well-being. So we conducted 4 studies, and in each of these studies we considered the perception of job insecurity as the crucial factor linked to self-objectification. And why? Because literature found that is more this perception rather than the factual condition of job insecurity that can undermine workers' identity and workers' well-being. So also in our studies we consider the perception of job insecurity as the most proximal predictor of these self-objectifying views. And in the first study we asked Italian workers to reply to a questionnaire in which we ask them to evaluate their perception of, to rate their perception of job insecurity and their well-being, general well-being. And then, obviously, we also had 2 measures for self-objectification. The first was related to the self-attribution of human mental states, and the second was related to the self-perception as instrument-like versus human-like. So workers had to evaluate how much during their daily work activity they felt able to experience different mental states, or they self-perceive as more similar to instruments rather than human. And furthermore, in this study, we had 2 measures to take under control the 2 other main antecedents of self-objectification, that is the perception of the objectifying job features of the work activity and the perception of being objectified by superiors. We decided to include also this kind of variables because we wanted to take under control these 2 factors that we know are have a great influence on self-objectifying perception. And what we found? We found the expected correlations between the perception of job insecurity and the decreased self-attribution of human mental state and increased self-perception as instrument-like. And these 2 dimensions of self-objectification were correlated with decreased well-being. Then we perform this mediational model, and we can see that when we control for the perception of being objectified by the superior and the perception of the objectifying job features, the perception of job insecurity was associated with decreased self-attribution of mental state and increased self-perception as instrument-like, that in turn were associated both to decreased well-being. In a second study, we replicated these findings by taking under control the job contract of our workers. So we had both workers with both permanent and temporary job contract, and we measure perceived job insecurity, self-objectification, and well-being, and we found similar results for correlations. So perception of job insecurity was associated with the 2 dimensions of self-objectification that in turn were related to decreased well-being. And also in this case, we can see that in the mediational model, even when we control for the type of contract, the perception of job insecurity is strictly related to a decreased self-attribution of mental state and an increased self-perception as instrument-like. And in this specific mediational model, only the self-attribution of human mental state play a mediational role by being associated with decreased well-being. Then we decided to replicate these findings with an experimental study in which we asked participants to come to the lab and to perform a work simulation, and the participants were randomly assigned to the insecurity or the control condition. The work simulation consisted in asking participants to perform the role of a proofreader for a fictitious journal, and at the beginning of the work simulation they received an email account to which the editorial staff sent some messages. The simulation consisted in 2 periods of work that lasted 15 minutes each one, and during the break between these 2 periods, the participant in the insecurity condition received an email in which they received a threat of layoff. And in the control condition, instead, the participant did not receive any email during the break. So then we measure the perception of job insecurity, self-objectifying perception, and well-being during this work simulation. And also in this case, we consider a variable as to be taken under control. Indeed, we measured also the perception of the objectifying job features of this performed activity of proofreader, because we wanted to take under control these factors strictly related to self-objectification. And so what we have found? We have found that also in this case, perception of job insecurity was associated with self-attribution of human mental state and self-perception is instrument-like, and both these 2 dimensions were related to well-being. Furthermore, we found that the experimental conditions have had a direct effect on the perception of job insecurity. So in the experimental condition, our participants perceived more job insecurity, but we did not find a direct effect of the experimental condition on the other variables. But this is in line with literature that says us that is not the factual condition of job insecurity, so our experimental condition that undermine workers' identities and well-being, but is more the perception of this job insecurity. And we can see this kind of pattern with our mediational model, which we can see that participants in the job insecurity conditions perceive more job insecurity. This perception of job insecurity was related to an increased self-perception as instrument-like that in turn decrease our well-being. However, in this specific mediational model, we can see that the self-mental state attribution lost its role of mediator, but we can also see that in this case we had a great impact of our control variable, the objectified job features, that unlikely characterized our activity of proofreader. And so we decided to conduct a final study in which we adopt a more simple manipulation that allowed us to avoid this potential confounding variable. And so we decided to use a scenario paradigm in which participants participate to an online experiment, and they were randomly assigned to an insecurity versus control condition, and in both the condition they read at the beginning the same scenario in which they were asked to imagine to be hired for a company with a very good contract and so on. In the insecurity condition, then the scenario ended in this way. So participants read that the company was hit by a major economic crisis, and so their contract was at risk. In the control condition, instead, they read that the company continued to be robust, and so their contract was confirmed. So then we measure the perception of job insecurity, the self-objectification, and the general well-being in this hypothetical scenario, and we confirm our correlational results. So the perception of job insecurity was related to the two dimensions of self-objectification that in turn were related to well-being. And in this case, our experimental condition had an impact on all the variables. And we can see in this last mediational model, the participants in the job insecurity conditions perceive more job insecurity that were related to decreased self-mental state attribution and increased self-perception as instrument-like. And in this case, self-mental state attribution played a significant role in undermining general well-being. So what we can conclude on the basis of this result, that perception of job insecurity is robustly associated with increased people's self-objectification, and these self-objectifying perception in turn are related to the decrease of general well-being. So there are a lot, in conclusion, there are obviously several limitations related to this research, and other future research should go on to deepen our knowledge on these processes. But I would like to conclude with this consideration that it's important to go on to understand the impact of job insecurity on workers' identity, because work still have an important role in our self-definition, and because we live in a century that is strictly characterized by this job insecurity. And so further research is needed in order to find a way to protect workers and our perception of humanness in this time of insecurity. So I would like to thank my colleagues that conducted this research with me, and I would like to thank you all for your attention.